The moment someone stops feeling guilty is often the moment you realize the marriage has already ended. My name is Ethan Walker, and by the time my wife pulled into our driveway that cold Thursday evening, I already knew she had been lying to me. The strange part was that I did not feel angry anymore. I felt empty. I had been sitting alone in our dark living room for nearly an hour, listening to the soft ticking of the clock above the fireplace, while the headlights from passing cars briefly illuminated the walls of the house we had built together. Every few minutes I looked toward the front window, not because I was waiting for Claire to come home, but because I was wondering whether the woman walking through that door would still be the person I believed I had married. Earlier that afternoon, I had left work before sunset after a meeting was unexpectedly canceled. I decided to stop at a small coffee shop downtown before heading home. It was one of those quiet places where people worked on laptops or read books without speaking above a whisper. I ordered a medium black coffee and sat near the front window, thinking about nothing more important than what we might cook for dinner that evening. Then I saw Claire. She walked across the street wearing the same cream-colored coat I had bought her for Christmas 2 years earlier. She was smiling. Not the polite smile she used with neighbors or cashiers, but the smile I remembered from the first months of our relationship. Beside her was Ryan Mitchell, the man she always referred to as a closed chapter from another lifetime. Her former husband. They disappeared into a restaurant across the street, and something inside me told me not to follow them, yet I could not look away. Through the large front windows, I watched them talking for nearly an hour. They leaned toward each other with the effortless comfort of people who had never truly become strangers. Ryan laughed first. Claire reached across the table for just a brief second, and although the gesture looked innocent to anyone else, it shattered something inside me because I recognized the familiarity behind it. I did not interrupt them. I did not take photographs. I did not call her phone. I simply paid for my untouched coffee and drove home in complete silence. Now I heard the sound of Claire's car entering the driveway. A few seconds later, the front door opened, and she stepped inside carrying a grocery bag and wearing the same warm smile she had shared with Ryan only hours before. She greeted me with an easy hello, apologized for being a little late, and explained that traffic had been unusually heavy downtown. Her voice was calm, confident, almost effortless. I smiled back because I suddenly understood something painful. The hardest lies are never the dramatic ones. They are the ordinary ones delivered with complete confidence. Claire walked into the kitchen, placed fresh vegetables on the counter, and casually asked whether I wanted grilled chicken or pasta for dinner. The smell of fresh basil filled the room, while soft music played from the speaker near the dining table. Everything looked exactly the way it always had, yet nothing felt familiar anymore. I watched her moving around our kitchen, humming quietly to herself, completely unaware that the version of our marriage she believed still existed had quietly ended long before she unlocked the front door that evening. As I stood there in silence, I realized I was no longer waiting for an explanation. I was waiting to discover how long she had been saying goodbye while I was still planning forever. I barely touched my dinner that night. Claire chatted comfortably across the table about a new project at work, a neighbor who had planted flowers too early for the season, and the television show she wanted us to watch over the weekend. Every sentence sounded ordinary. Every smile looked familiar. Yet after what I had seen that afternoon, even the smallest details carried a different meaning. I noticed how carefully she placed her phone face down beside her plate. I noticed how quickly she reached for it whenever the screen lit up. Months earlier, I would have dismissed those habits without a second thought. Marriage teaches you to trust before you question. Once trust begins to crack, however, even silence starts sounding suspicious. That night, I lay awake long after. Claire had fallen asleep. The soft rhythm of her breathing filled the bedroom, while the digital clock beside the bed slowly changed from 1 hour to the next. I kept replaying the image of her sitting across from Ryan inside that restaurant. It was not because they had done anything dramatic. It was because they looked completely comfortable together. There was no awkwardness, no hesitation, no distance. It was the kind of ease that only comes from people who never truly stopped knowing each other. The following morning I left for work earlier than usual. The interstate was unusually quiet, giving me more time than I wanted to think. I began remembering moments from the past several months that had once seemed completely harmless. Claire had started volunteering to run errands alone on Saturday afternoons. She often said she needed fresh air after long work weeks. She had become strangely protective of her calendar, laughing whenever I asked what kept her so busy. She stopped inviting me to office gatherings, explaining that they were mostly networking events where I would probably feel bored. None of those changes had alarmed me because every marriage evolves over time. I believed giving each other space was a sign of respect, not distance. Looking back, I wondered whether I had mistaken emotional separation for healthy independence. Around lunchtime, my younger sister Emily called to ask whether Claire and I planned to attend our parents' anniversary dinner the following weekend. During our conversation, she hesitated before asking if everything was all right between us. I laughed softly and told her we were simply busy with work. Emily apologized for asking and admitted Claire had seemed distracted the last few times the family got together. I brushed the comment aside because defending my wife had become almost automatic. Even after seeing the truth with my own eyes, part of me still wanted someone to prove I had misunderstood everything. That afternoon, my best friend, Jason, invited me to grab coffee after work. We had known each other since college, and he could usually tell when something was bothering me before I said a word. We sat outside beneath a large maple tree while people walked past carrying shopping bags and talking on their phones. After several quiet minutes, I finally told him what I had seen. Jason lowered his eyes toward his coffee cup and remained silent longer than I expected. My stomach tightened before he even spoke. He admitted that nearly 2 months earlier, he had noticed Claire talking with Ryan outside a bookstore downtown. She had explained they had accidentally run into each other and spent a few minutes catching up. Jason believed her because he trusted her almost as much as I did, and he never wanted to create problems inside my marriage based on one brief encounter. I nodded slowly because I understood exactly why he stayed quiet. He had made the same mistake I had. We both believed honesty was stronger than appearances. As I drove home that evening, one question echoed through my mind again and again. If the people closest to me had already witnessed pieces of this story, how many chapters had been unfolding while I was still convinced I was living inside a happy marriage? For the next several days, I carried the truth without saying a single word. It followed me into every room of our house, sat beside me during meetings at work, and stayed awake with me long after Claire had fallen asleep each night. She continued living exactly as she always had, smiling over breakfast, asking about my day, and making weekend plans as though nothing had changed. Watching her move through our home with such effortless normality was somehow more painful than the discovery itself. I kept asking myself whether she had become comfortable hiding the truth or whether she honestly believed I would never notice. The question never left my mind. By Friday evening, I realized I could no longer keep pretending everything was normal. Claire told me she had a dinner meeting with coworkers and expected to be home a little late. She kissed my cheek before leaving and reminded me not to wait up if I became tired. After the front door closed behind her, I walked into the small home office where we kept old family albums inside a wooden cabinet. I pulled out our wedding album and slowly turned each page. There we were, standing beneath a clear summer sky, laughing as friends tossed flower petals into the air. There we were dancing at our reception while my father smiled from the front table. Every photograph captured two people who genuinely believed they would grow old together. I traced my finger across one picture where Claire was looking directly at me, and I wondered whether she had already forgotten the promises we made that afternoon or whether life had quietly changed her long before either of us realized it. My phone buzzed just after 8 o'clock. It was Jason asking whether I wanted to grab coffee. I almost declined, but something inside me needed to speak to someone who knew me before my marriage. Someone who remembered the version of me that existed before doubt replaced certainty. We met at a quiet diner near the edge of town where the waitresses still knew regular customers by name. Jason listened without interrupting while I explained how impossible it had become to separate truth from memory. I told him I no longer knew which moments in my marriage had been genuine and which had only seemed genuine because I trusted too easily. He leaned back in his chair and quietly said something I will never forget. He told me that one betrayal does not erase every honest moment that came before it. People can love sincerely and still make devastating choices later. Hearing those words did not remove my pain, but they stopped me from rewriting my entire life as a lie. Around 10 o'clock, I returned home. Claire's car was already parked in the driveway. She was upstairs taking a shower, and soft music echoed through the hallway. As I walked into the kitchen for a glass of water, I noticed her phone resting on the countertop beside her purse. The screen suddenly lit up with a new notification before fading again. I did not touch the phone or unlock it. I simply glanced at the message preview that appeared across the lock screen. It read, "Thank you for tonight. I still miss talking to you." There was no name displayed, only an unfamiliar number. My hands remained completely still as I looked away and placed the glass back into the sink. I no longer needed another explanation, another coincidence, or another excuse that sounded believable enough to delay the inevitable. The truth had already revealed itself piece by piece, and I finally understood that the next conversation Claire and I had would decide whether we were still husband and wife on paper alone, or whether we still had any chance of saving what remained of our marriage. The following morning, I woke before sunrise without needing an alarm. The house was completely still, and for a few peaceful seconds I almost forgot everything that had happened. Then I looked at the empty space beside me where Claire was still sleeping, and reality quietly returned. I walked downstairs and started the coffee maker out of habit. The familiar aroma slowly filled the kitchen while pale morning lights spilled through the windows overlooking our backyard. Claire eventually came downstairs wearing one of my old sweatshirts and smiled as though we were beginning another ordinary Saturday together. She thanked me for making coffee and casually asked if I wanted to drive to the farmer's market later that morning. Her voice carried the same warmth that had once made me believe I could trust her with every part of my life. I looked at her for a long moment before answering. Instead of saying yes, I quietly asked if we could sit down and talk first. The smile on her face faded almost immediately. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table where we had shared thousands of breakfasts over the years. Outside, a gentle breeze moved through the trees while a neighbor walked his dog along the sidewalk. Everything beyond our walls continued exactly as it always had, making the silence inside our home feel even heavier. I asked her one simple question. I asked whether there was anything she needed to tell me. She looked confused for a brief moment before asking what I meant. I held her eyes and calmly said Ryan's name. The room became perfectly still. Claire lowered her gaze toward the coffee cup in front of her and wrapped both hands around it without taking a sip. She did not deny seeing him. She did not accuse me of being paranoid. She simply closed her eyes for a few seconds as though she had been carrying the same secret for much longer than I realized. When she finally spoke, her voice was almost too quiet to hear. She admitted she had been meeting Ryan again for several months. At first, she insisted they only wanted closure after years apart. They talked about mistakes they had both made when they were younger. They remembered places they used to visit and conversations they never finished. She said those meetings gradually became something she never expected. I listened without interrupting because none of the explanations changed the truth. Then I asked the only question that truly mattered. I asked whether she still loved him. Tears slowly filled her eyes before she answered. She said she did not know exactly when it happened, but somewhere along the way she realized she had never completely stopped caring about him. Hearing those words felt strangely peaceful because uncertainty finally disappeared. There was nothing left for me to investigate, question, or imagine. The truth was sitting across from me in complete honesty for the first time in months. Claire reached across the table as though she wanted to hold my hand, but I quietly pulled mine away. She began apologizing, telling me that I had always been kind, dependable, and supportive. She said I had done nothing wrong. Every compliment sounded painfully empty because appreciation cannot repair broken trust. I gently asked whether she wanted to remain my wife or whether she wanted to discover what a future with Ryan might look like. She cried quietly before admitting she believed she needed to find that answer for herself. I slowly stood from the table and looked around the kitchen where so many ordinary memories had been created. In that moment, I realized I could not keep fighting for a marriage after the person standing beside me had already started building another future in her heart. Without raising my voice or blaming her for the choices she had made, I accepted that the life we once promised each other had reached its final morning. I packed only one small duffel bag before leaving the house that afternoon. There was no dramatic argument waiting at the front door and no desperate attempt to stop me. Claire remained seated at the kitchen table with tears quietly falling into the untouched cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. I paused for a moment beside the family photographs hanging along the hallway wall. There were vacations at the beach, birthdays with our parents, road trips through the mountains, and countless ordinary Saturdays that had once felt like proof our future was secure. I did not take any of those pictures with me. Memories belong to the people who lived them, even when their paths eventually separate. I quietly picked up my keys, opened the front door, and stepped outside. The cool afternoon air felt strangely different, as though I were breathing for the first time in weeks. I drove directly to Jason's apartment because he had insisted I stay with him for as long as I needed. He never asked unnecessary questions after I arrived. He simply handed me a spare key, showed me the guest room, and ordered pizza without pretending food could solve heartbreak. That simple kindness meant more than any speech ever could. During the following days, Claire and I communicated only through short messages about practical matters. We agreed to meet with a mediator instead of turning our separation into a long legal battle. Neither of us argued over furniture, savings, or household belongings. The process felt painfully calm, almost as though two polite strangers were organizing paperwork instead of ending a marriage that had once meant everything to both of them. When the final documents were signed several weeks later, Claire quietly thanked me for making everything easier than she deserved. I looked at her for a moment before answering that there was already enough pain between us without creating more. She nodded silently because she understood exactly what I meant. After the divorce became official, I rented a small one-bedroom apartment on the opposite side of the city. It overlooked a quiet public park where children played basketball after school and older couples walked their dogs every evening. The apartment was much smaller than the house Claire and I had shared, but for the first time in months the silence inside my home belonged only to me. There were no unanswered questions waiting in the next room. No hidden conversations taking place beyond my knowledge. Only honest quiet. I slowly began creating new routines. Every morning I woke before sunrise, made coffee, and jogged through the park before work. I learned how to cook meals I had always depended on Claire to prepare. I accepted invitations from coworkers instead of spending weekends alone with my thoughts. Jason eventually convinced me to join him on Saturday morning hiking trips, and although I rarely spoke during those first outings, watching the sun rise over quiet trails reminded me that the world continued moving forward regardless of what had happened in my personal life. Weeks gradually became months, and something inside me began changing. The sharp pain that once followed me everywhere slowly became a quiet memory instead of a daily burden. One evening, while unpacking the last sealed box from my old house, I found my wedding ring resting inside a small velvet case. I held it in my hand for several minutes before placing it gently inside a desk drawer rather than throwing it away. It represented a promise I had made sincerely, even if life had taken us somewhere neither of us expected. As I closed the drawer, I realized healing had never been about forgetting Claire or pretending our marriage never existed. It was about learning that another person's choices did not have the power to decide who I would become. I believed that chapter of my life had finally reached its peaceful ending, never imagining that exactly 1 year later Claire would unexpectedly return carrying words I could never have predicted. Exactly 1 year passed before I heard Claire's voice again. By then my life no longer revolved around what had happened between us. The apartment that once felt temporary had become home. My morning runs through the park had become a habit instead of an escape. I had earned a promotion at work, reconnected with old friends, and even learned to enjoy quiet evenings without feeling that something was missing. Healing had not arrived in one dramatic moment. It had appeared through hundreds of ordinary days until I finally realized my future no longer depended on my past. Then, on a cool Tuesday afternoon, my phone rang with a number I no longer recognized. I almost ignored it because I was leaving the office after another long meeting, but something made me answer anyway. The voice on the other end was soft, hesitant, and instantly familiar. It was Claire. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The silence felt completely different from the silence we had shared during our marriage. Back then, it had been filled with uncertainty. Now it was simply two people standing on opposite sides of a life that no longer belonged to both of them. She quietly asked whether I would be willing to meet for coffee. She said there were things she had needed to say for a long time and that she would understand if I refused. I looked across the parking lot as employees walked toward their cars, thinking about how different that question would have sounded a year earlier. Back then, I would have done anything just to spend another hour with her. Now I calmly checked my schedule before agreeing to meet the following Saturday afternoon. We chose a small cafe downtown, only a few blocks away from the same street where I had first seen her with Ryan. When Saturday arrived, I reached the cafe several minutes early. The familiar smell of roasted coffee beans filled the room, while soft jazz played quietly through ceiling speakers. Sunlight streamed through the front windows, warming the wooden tables where strangers read books and worked on laptops without noticing anyone else. Claire arrived wearing a navy sweater, dark jeans, and a simple silver necklace I had never seen before. She looked healthy, but there was a tiredness in her eyes that makeup could not hide. She smiled politely before taking the chair across from me. At first, our conversation stayed safely on ordinary topics. She asked about my job, and I told her I had recently accepted more responsibility at work. I asked about her parents, and she said they were doing well. We talked about the weather, mutual friends, and how quickly another year had passed. Then the conversation slowed. Claire wrapped both hands around her coffee cup without taking a sip. Finally, she looked directly at me and quietly admitted that she and Ryan were no longer together. I simply nodded and waited. She explained that the relationship she had imagined for so many years never became the reality she expected. The excitement of reconnecting with the past slowly faded into disappointment, misunderstandings, and the realization that both of them had become completely different people. I listened without judgment because none of it surprised me anymore. Memories often preserve people exactly as we wish they had remained, while real life quietly changes everyone. Claire took a slow breath before saying there was one more reason she had asked me to meet. The expression on her face told me the hardest part of the conversation had not even begun, and something in her eyes warned me that the words she was about to speak would reopen a chapter one believed had already been closed forever. Claire lowered her eyes to the table and slowly wrapped both hands around her coffee cup as though she needed something steady to hold. I waited without speaking because I had learned over the past year that silence often reveals more truth than questions ever could. After several long seconds, she finally looked back at me. Her voice was calm, but I could hear the weight behind every word. She admitted that the life she imagined with Ryan had never become the life she actually lived. They argued about small things that slowly became larger things. The familiarity she had mistaken for destiny slowly disappeared once everyday responsibilities replaced old memories. She said she spent months wondering how everything had gone so wrong after believing she had finally made the right choice. I listened without interruption because none of those details belonged to me anymore. They were simply consequences of decisions she had already made. She took another slow breath before saying there was one thought she could never escape. She told me she kept replaying the day our marriage ended, searching for the exact moment everything became impossible to repair. Then she quietly spoke the sentence I never expected to hear. She said she believed that if I had fought harder for our marriage, she might never have gone back to Ryan. For a brief moment, I honestly wondered whether I had misunderstood her. She continued before I could answer. She said I accepted the divorce too calmly. She said I packed my bag, signed the papers, and walked away without trying to stop her. She admitted she had secretly expected me to beg her to stay, to refuse to let the marriage end, to convince her she was making the biggest mistake of her life. She looked at me with tears gathering in her eyes and whispered that perhaps if I had fought harder, she would have realized sooner what she was about to lose. The words settled quietly between us while the sounds of ordinary conversations continued throughout the cafe. A barista called out someone's order near the counter. A young couple laughed softly by the front window. Outside, people crossed the street carrying shopping bags beneath the afternoon sun, completely unaware that my past had just reached across the table and tried to place its weight back into my hands. I looked at Claire for a long time before saying anything, because I wanted to understand what she was truly asking. She was not asking for another chance. She was not asking me to erase the past. She was asking me to accept responsibility for a decision that had always belonged to her. She quietly admitted that after Ryan left, she spent countless nights wondering whether our marriage could have survived if I had refused to let her go so easily. She said she blamed herself for a long time, then blamed Ryan, and eventually found herself blaming me because it seemed easier than accepting that no one had forced her to walk away. Hearing that confession did not make me angry. It made me unexpectedly sad. The woman sitting across from me was still searching for a version of history where someone else could carry the burden of her choices. I folded my hands together on the table and took one slow breath. During the darkest months after our divorce, I had imagined this conversation many times. I imagined defending myself. I imagined reminding her of every sacrifice I had made and every promise I had kept. Instead, I felt something entirely different. I felt peace. For the first time since our marriage had ended, I realized I no longer needed Claire to understand my love in order to know that it had been real. I gently looked into her eyes and prepared to tell her the truth I had carried silently for an entire year, knowing that whatever happened next would become the final chapter of our story. I let the silence remain between us for several seconds before answering, because some truths deserve a quiet beginning. I looked at Claire with the same calm expression I had carried into the cafe and gently told her that I had fought for our marriage every single day we were together. I explained that fighting does not always look like shouting, begging, or refusing to let someone leave. Sometimes fighting means showing up every morning, keeping your promises, building a home together, working through ordinary disappointments, and choosing the same person again and again without asking for applause. I reminded her that I trusted her completely because I believed trust was the foundation of every lasting marriage. I trusted her when she stayed late at work. I trusted her when she wanted more time for herself. I trusted her when she told me not to worry. None of those choices made me weak. They made me the husband I promised I would be on our wedding day. Claire quietly lowered her eyes, but I continued because she deserved honesty just as much as I did. I reminded her of the morning we sat together at our kitchen table after I discovered the truth. I asked whether she still loved Ryan, and she answered that part of her heart had never completely let him go. I told her that at that moment I understood something that changed my life forever. Love cannot survive where it must compete with someone else's unfinished past. I could have begged her to stay. I could have argued for weeks, refused to sign the papers, or tried to convince her that our marriage deserved another chance. But even if I had succeeded in keeping her physically beside me, I knew I could never force her heart to return. That is not love. That is fear. She slowly looked back at me with tears filling her eyes. I gently told her that the day I packed my bag was not the day I stopped loving her. It was the day I finally respected both of us enough to accept the truth she had already spoken. I refused to spend the rest of my life wondering whether my wife wished she were somewhere else every time she smiled at me. Claire quietly whispered that she never realized how much those words had hurt me. I nodded because I believed her. Sometimes people only understand the weight of a decision after they have already lived with its consequences. She apologized again, this time without trying to explain or defend herself. Her voice trembled as she admitted she had spent the past year searching for someone else to blame because accepting full responsibility felt unbearable. First, she blamed Ryan for disappointing her. Then she blamed circumstances. Eventually, she blamed me because believing I had given up too easily somehow hurt less than admitting she had willingly walked away from the safest love she had ever known. I listened with genuine compassion because I no longer needed to win the conversation. I had already won something much more valuable. I had rebuilt a life that no longer depended on someone else's choices. I quietly told Claire that I forgave her long ago, not because what happened was acceptable, but because carrying resentment would have allowed the past to continue controlling my future. Forgiveness had never reopened the door to our marriage. It simply allowed me to close that door without bitterness. As the afternoon sunlight slowly shifted across the cafe floor, I realized this conversation was no longer about assigning blame. It was about finally releasing both of us from a story that had already reached its ending, even if neither of us had been ready to admit it until now. Claire remained silent after I finished speaking. She slowly wiped the tears from her face and stared into the coffee that had long since grown cold. After several quiet moments, she finally looked back at me and asked one last question. She wanted to know whether I had ever truly forgiven her. I smiled gently because the answer had changed over time. During the first weeks after our divorce, forgiveness had seemed impossible. Every memory carried pain, and every ordinary place reminded me of the future I believed we had lost forever. But as the months passed, I realized that holding on to resentment only kept me connected to the worst chapter of my life. I quietly told Claire that I had forgiven her many months ago, not because forgetting was easy or because what happened no longer mattered, but because I refused to let bitterness become the person I would be for the rest of my life. Forgiveness had never been about giving our marriage another chance. It had been about giving myself permission to move forward without carrying anger into every new day. Claire listened without interrupting. Her shoulders relaxed slightly as though hearing those words removed a burden she had been carrying for a very long time. She admitted she had spent the past year imagining dozens of different conversations between us. In some of them, I hated her forever. In others, I begged her to come home. She confessed that she never imagined I would simply find peace. I softly told her that peace was never something I discovered all at once. It arrived one ordinary morning at a time. It was making coffee in my small apartment without feeling lonely. It was laughing with Jason during a weekend hike. It was calling my parents without pretending everything was fine. It was waking up one day and realizing I had gone several hours without thinking about the life I used to have. Healing was never dramatic. It quietly appeared inside ordinary moments until I finally understood that my future no longer depended on someone else's regret. Claire lowered her eyes again and whispered that losing me had taught her more about love than keeping me ever did. I believed she meant every word, but I also understood that some lessons arrive only after the opportunity to change the outcome has already passed. We both stood from the table at nearly the same moment. The cafe had become much quieter as the afternoon slowly faded toward evening. We walked together to the front door without speaking. Outside, the streets were calm, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh rain drifting through the city. Claire stopped on the sidewalk and thanked me for meeting her. Then she apologized one final time, not with long explanations or promises, but with simple honesty. I wished her well with complete sincerity because I no longer wanted anything bad to happen to her. Wanting peace for someone who once hurt you is sometimes the clearest sign that you have truly healed. She smiled through her tears, nodded once, and quietly walked toward her car without looking back. I watched her disappear into the flow of afternoon traffic before turning in the opposite direction. The city around me looked exactly the same as it always had, yet everything inside me felt different. A year earlier, I believed my life had ended when my marriage ended. Now I understood it had simply become the beginning of a different story. Some people spend years hoping the person who left them will finally realize what they lost. I discovered something far more valuable. I no longer needed that realization to feel complete. The greatest victory was never proving that I had been enough. It was learning that my worth had never depended on being chosen by someone who had already chosen another path. As I continued walking beneath the quiet evening sky, I carried no anger, no desire for revenge, and no unfinished words. I carried only gratitude for the life I had rebuilt, confidence in the man I had become,